Think about the last time you bought tickets for a concert, a game, or some other major event. You opened the app, found your seats, and saw that they were 80 bucks. Not bad, right? But then you went to checkout, and suddenly the total was $120. Wait, what? Where did that extra 40 bucks come from? You look at the receipt. Service fee, facility charge, processing fee. It feels like they are just making up words at this point. Naturally, most of us do the same thing. We get angry, complain about the fees for a few seconds, and then type in our card information anyway because we still want to see the show. But what if you refused? What if you closed the app, drove down to the venue, and bought a physical ticket directly from the box office? Like it is 1955. In theory, that should allow you to avoid the online service fees. Except, have you actually tried doing that lately? First, good luck finding a box office that is open. Many venues have reduced their operating hours to a small window on event days. For some events, walk up purchases are not available at all. But say you do find an open window. You walk up to the glass, speak to the employee inside, and ask them to pull up a ticket for your chosen seat. Do you know what software is probably running on the screen in front of them? It is the same system you were trying to avoid. You might have left the app, driven across town, found parking, and walked into the venue, but you never actually left the ticketing system. And that is what makes Ticketmaster so unusual. It is not simply a website where people buy tickets. It has spent decades placing itself between the customer, the venue, the promoter, and sometimes even the artist. No matter which direction you approach the transaction from, there is a good chance you eventually run into the same company. Which made me wonder, how did Ticketmaster become this powerful? Why are the fees so difficult to avoid? And why do venues, promoters, and artists continue working with a company that their own customers seem to hate? And honestly, figuring out the clever and sometimes devious strategies behind giants like Ticketmaster, Apple, and others, that is exactly what we do on this channel. If you want to see how the world's biggest industries actually work under the hood, hit that subscribe button. It is completely free, and I promise we will never charge you a convenience fee at checkout. Now, back to our story. The answer goes back 50 years to a business model that was designed before the internet existed. To understand it, you first have to understand what selling tickets looked like before computerized systems. Back then, ticketing was a low tech, highly mechanical operation built around the physical control of paper. Inside the box office, venues used large wooden or metal racks containing individual slots for different sections and seats. Before an event, the venue would print one physical ticket for every seat in the building. Each ticket would then be placed into the correct slot. When someone walked up to the window and paid, the seller physically pulled that ticket from the rack and handed it over. Once the ticket was removed, the seat was sold. That system worked reasonably well if everyone buying tickets lived near the venue, but most people did not want to drive all the way to a stadium or theater just to purchase a ticket for an event that might still be weeks away. So venues began partnering with local outlets such as record stores, department stores, and other retail locations. The problem was that there was no shared database connecting any of these locations. The venue had to divide its physical tickets between them. The main box office might keep the floor seats and Section A. A record store downtown might receive a stack of tickets for Section B. A department store across town might receive Section C. If you went to the record store, you could only buy the seats that had been physically delivered to that store. Even if the venue still had dozens of excellent seats available, the record store had no way of seeing or selling them. If its small allotment sold out, the employees would have to call the venue, ask whether more tickets were available, and somehow arrange for those tickets to be transferred. Or they would simply tell you to try another outlet. It was slow, fragmented, and extremely difficult to manage. Then, in 1967, a company called Ticketron launched one of the first computerized real time public ticketing systems. Ticketron placed remote terminals inside retail stores and connected them to a centralized mainframe computer. Instead of dividing physical stacks of tickets among different outlets, the entire venue's inventory could now exist inside one shared digital database. A terminal inside a record store in the suburbs could access the same pool of seats as the main box office. Every location could see which seats were available and sell them in real time. That was a major technological breakthrough. By 1970, Ticketron had become the dominant company in computerized ticketing. But there was one important weakness in its business model. Ticketron was controlled by Control Data Corporation, a major computer hardware company. Control Data did not really think of ticketing as an entertainment business. To them, ticketing was another way to sell access to mainframe computers and data processing systems. The venues were treated like ordinary technology clients. If a theater or stadium wanted to use Ticketron's network, it had to pay for the terminals, the telephone connections, and the service itself. Ticketron charged venues for each ticket processed through the system. It also charged consumers a relatively small service fee and kept that fee for itself. For Ticketron, the arrangement made sense. It provided the technology so both the venue and the customer paid for the service. But from the venue's perspective, Ticketron was another expense. The venue paid for access to the system while Ticketron collected the service fees. That small misalignment would eventually create an opening for a competitor. Ticketmaster was founded in 1976 by two staff members at Arizona State University. Albert Leffler worked in event booking at the university's Performing Arts Center, while Peter Gadwa was a programmer in the university's Information Technology department. They realized that the university needed a better system for selling and tracking tickets for its theatrical productions, so they built their own ticketing software and began licensing it to other schools and regional venues. But for its first several years, Ticketmaster was not a major threat. It was a smaller company competing against Ticketron, which already had the technology, the terminals, the retail network, and the relationships. Ticketmaster was essentially trying to imitate a company that had already won. That changed in 1982. Jay Pritzker, the owner of Hyatt Hotels and an investor known for acquiring struggling businesses, bought Ticketmaster. He hired a corporate lawyer named Fred Rosen to run it. Rosen looked at Ticketmaster and quickly saw the problem. The company was trying to beat Ticketron by selling a similar service to the same customers. Ticketron was larger, more established, and already controlled much of the market. If Ticketmaster continued competing on technology alone, it would probably lose. So Rosen changed the offer. He realized that the person buying the ticket was not necessarily Ticketmaster's most important customer, the venue was. And if Ticketmaster could make the venue more money than Ticketron did, the venue would have a reason to switch. Under Ticketron's model, venues paid to lease the terminals and telephone lines. They paid transaction costs, while Ticketron kept the consumer service fees. Rosen offered venues almost the opposite arrangement. Ticketmaster would install the terminal hardware and telephone connections for free. It would raise the service fees charged to customers and share a significant portion of that money with the venues and promoters. In some cases, Ticketmaster also offered large advances based on the service fees an arena or theater was expected to generate in the future. Suddenly, the ticketing system was no longer an expense for the venue, it became a source of revenue. That completely changed the competition. Ticketron was asking venues to pay for ticketing, Ticketmaster was offering to pay them, and there was another advantage hidden inside the arrangement. The customer did not see the venue collecting part of the fee. The name sitting on the checkout page was Ticketmaster. When fans saw an expensive service charge, they blamed the ticketing company. Ticketmaster could absorb the anger while the venues and promoters quietly benefited from the revenue. The public saw a greedy middleman. The venue saw a partner that had installed its equipment, trained its employees, simplified its operations, advanced it money, and created an entirely new stream of income. This is the central reason Ticketmaster grew so quickly. It was not simply offering better software, it had redesigned the incentives around the entire transaction. The company understood that it did not need fans to love it, it needed venues to choose it. And the more customers complained about Ticketmaster instead of the venue, the more valuable Ticketmaster became to the venue. By the end of the 1980s, Ticketron was losing ground. It could not easily compete against a company that was offering free equipment, guaranteed advances, and a share of the fees. In 1991, Ticketmaster acquired what remained of Ticketron. But buying its largest competitor was only one part of the strategy. Ticketmaster also signed long term exclusive contracts with stadiums, arenas, theaters, and other major venues across North America. These contracts meant that a venue could not simply offer customers several competing ticketing platforms. If Ticketmaster controlled the venue's primary ticketing contract, every major event held there would normally have to pass through Ticketmaster's system. And as more major venues signed exclusive agreements, it became increasingly difficult for artists and promoters to bypass the company. Ticketmaster was no longer just selling software, it was building a network. The value of that network became obvious during Ticketmaster's war with Pearl Jam in the 1990s. At the time, Pearl Jam was one of the biggest rock bands in America. The band had a young and loyal fan base, and its members were deeply uncomfortable with the rising cost of attending concerts. For their planned 1994 summer tour, Pearl Jam wanted tickets capped at $18. They also wanted the service fee limited to $1.80, or 10% of the ticket price. Ticketmaster refused. Its model depended on service fees large enough to support the revenue sharing agreements that kept venues and promoters loyal. Allowing one of the largest bands in the country to impose a very low fee cap would threaten that arrangement. Pearl Jam was furious. The band filed an antitrust complaint with the Department of Justice, accusing Ticketmaster of using its market power to control the concert business and punish artists that refused to accept its terms. Band members Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament later testified before a congressional subcommittee. But Pearl Jam did not just complain. The band decided to prove that it could tour without Ticketmaster. That is when it discovered that avoiding Ticketmaster was not as simple as using a different ticketing company. Ticketmaster had exclusive agreements with many of the established arenas, theaters, and amphitheaters capable of hosting a major national tour. So Pearl Jam began looking for alternative locations: open fields, state fairgrounds, horse tracks, ski resorts, temporary outdoor sites. On paper, this seemed possible. In practice, it meant rebuilding much of the infrastructure that a traditional venue normally provided. The band had to deal with temporary stages, security, crowd control, portable toilets, parking, local permits, zoning restrictions, weather risks, and safety requirements. Pearl Jam was not merely trying to replace a website. It was trying to recreate the physical infrastructure of a national concert tour. The project became a logistical and financial disaster. Shows were canceled, plans were disrupted, and the band lost millions of dollars. 11 days after Pearl Jam canceled its planned tour, the Department of Justice ended its antitrust investigation without taking action against Ticketmaster. Pearl Jam had assumed it was fighting a ticketing company on behalf of the venues, artists, and fans. But that misunderstood the structure of the business. The venues and promoters were not standing outside Ticketmaster's system waiting to be rescued. Many of them were making money from it. Pearl Jam was fighting an entire network of companies whose financial interests had become tied together. And the more venues Ticketmaster signed, the stronger that network became. Once enough major buildings used the system, artists had fewer practical alternatives. And once enough major artists toured through those buildings, smaller venues had an even stronger reason to sign with Ticketmaster. Each new contract made the next contract easier to win. Then the internet arrived. In the early 2000s, Ticketmaster moved aggressively into online ticketing. It merged with online city guide businesses such as CitySearch and expanded its presence on the internet. It also began acquiring secondary ticket marketplaces, including GetMeIn and TicketsNow. That allowed the company to position itself on both sides of the ticket market. It could make money when a ticket was initially sold and potentially make money again when that same ticket was resold. By 2008, Ticketmaster's largest threat was no longer another traditional ticketing company. It was Live Nation. Live Nation had become the world's largest concert promoter and controlled or operated dozens of important venues and amphitheaters. This gave Live Nation something Ticketmaster could not ignore: control over the actual events and locations feeding tickets into its system. Live Nation tried to bypass Ticketmaster by launching its own ticketing platform. For Ticketmaster, that was dangerous. A company that promoted the tours and controlled many of the venues could potentially remove a huge amount of inventory from Ticketmaster's network. But instead of continuing to fight, the two companies announced that they would merge. In 2010, Ticketmaster and Live Nation became Live Nation Entertainment. The merger connected several different levels of the live entertainment business inside one company. Live Nation could manage relationships with artists. It could promote their tours, It could own or operate the venues where those tours performed. And through Ticketmaster, it could control the primary ticketing system used to sell access to those events. That vertical integration made the company more powerful than Ticketmaster had ever been on its own. A venue considering another ticketing provider was no longer dealing only with the possibility of losing Ticketmaster's software. It also had to think about its relationship with the largest concert promoter in the world. Would Live Nation continue routing major tours through that venue? Would competing venues receive better events? Would the venue lose access to artists managed or promoted through the larger company? This is where the original partnership with venues began to change. In the early years, Ticketmaster had won venues by making their operations easier and more profitable. But as Ticketmaster and Live Nation became larger and more integrated, many venues also became increasingly dependent on the system. They had entered the relationship because it benefited them. Over time, walking away became much more difficult. Throughout the 2000s and 10s, frustration with Ticketmaster continued to grow. Tickets appeared to sell out almost instantly. Scalping bots purchased large quantities before ordinary fans could reach the checkout page. Dynamic pricing caused prices to rise in real time when demand surged. And every major tour seemed to create another story about confusing fees, unavailable seats, and tickets appearing on resale platforms at enormous markups. Then, in 2022, the presale for Taylor Swift's Eras Tour pushed that frustration into the national spotlight. Demand was enormous. Automated scalping activity added even more pressure. Ticketmaster's platform struggled under the traffic, and millions of fans were unable to purchase tickets. The incident became a major public scandal. It triggered congressional hearings, renewed political attention on so called junk fees, and increased scrutiny of the relationship between Ticketmaster and Live Nation. In May 2024, the Department of Justice, joined by a coalition of state attorneys general, filed an antitrust lawsuit seeking to break up Live Nation and Ticketmaster. The lawsuit accused the company of using exclusive contracts, threats, retaliation, and its control over multiple parts of the concert industry to suppress competitors and inflate prices. In March 2026, the Department of Justice reached a tentative settlement with Live Nation. The proposed agreement included up to $280 million in payments, restrictions on service fees at venues controlled by Live Nation, changes intended to allow independent venues to use multiple ticketing providers, and the sale or relinquishment of certain amphitheater interests. But several state attorneys general argued that the agreement did not go far enough. They rejected the settlement and continued pursuing their parallel case. Then, in April 2026, a federal jury found that Live Nation and Ticketmaster had maintained an illegal monopoly in the market for major concert venues. The verdict did not immediately break up the company. Live Nation continued to dispute the accusations, and the court still had to determine what remedies should be imposed. But for the first time in decades, the structure Ticketmaster had built faced a serious possibility of being pulled apart. And yet, even if Ticketmaster and Live Nation are eventually separated, there is a larger question. Does the business model itself disappear? Probably not, because Ticketmaster's real innovation was never the ticketing software. Ticketron had computerized ticketing before Ticketmaster even existed. The deeper innovation was recognizing that the visible customer and the actual customer did not have to be the same person. The fan was the person using the system and paying the fee, but the venue was the client Ticketmaster needed to satisfy. Ticketmaster gave venues better technology, lower operating costs, guaranteed advances, and a share of the service fee revenue. In return, the venues gave Ticketmaster long term exclusivity and control over their ticket inventory. And whenever customers became angry, most of that anger landed on Ticketmaster. You could think of it as a corporate lightning rod model. The company places itself at a crucial point in the transaction, carries out a practice the public dislikes, and accepts the reputational damage that comes with it. Meanwhile, the businesses behind the company receive part of the financial benefit without receiving an equal share of the blame. That does not mean the venues were innocent victims. Many of them willingly accepted the arrangement because it made their operations more profitable and more convenient. Ticketmaster allowed them to charge higher effective prices while maintaining the appearance that an outside distributor was responsible. A venue could tell fans that its hands were tied by Ticketmaster, even while receiving part of the money generated by Ticketmaster's fees. But the relationship also became more complicated over time. The venues helped build the system because it benefited them. Then many became dependent on the same system because Ticketmaster and Live Nation controlled so much of the surrounding industry. They were partners, beneficiaries, and eventually, in some cases, captives of the structure they had helped create. That is why the story of Ticketmaster is so interesting. It did not become dominant simply because it created a popular product. Most customers do not like the product. It did not win because it consistently offered the cheapest option. It often made the transaction more expensive. And it did not become powerful because artists and fans freely chose it over every alternative. It became powerful because it understood exactly whose loyalty mattered. Ticketmaster aligned itself with the venues and promoters, placed itself in the middle of the transaction, and made itself extremely difficult to remove. The customers could hate it, the artists could complain about it, politicians could investigate it, but as long as the venues made more money with Ticketmaster than without it, the system continued to grow. Ticketmaster understood something very early that many companies never figure out. In business, the most valuable asset you can own is not always the product. Sometimes it is the blame. And honestly, figuring out the clever and sometimes devious strategies behind giants like Ticketmaster, Apple, and others, that is exactly what we do on this channel. If you want to see how the world's biggest industries actually work under the hood, hit that subscribe button. It is completely free, and I promise we will never charge you a convenience fee at checkout.